Welcome to this afternoon discussion. My name is Emily Neal. I hail from the library and run a program called HLS Beyond, which brings non-curricular but interesting discussions and workshops to HLS students. Today we are going to hear about something I'm sure we are all unclear about. I'm going to do a quick introduction. I'm just going to let Mark and Jason take it from there. Jason Furman is the Aetna Professor of the Practice of Economic Policy jointly at HKS and the Department of Econ at Harvard University. He's also non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Furman engages in public policy through research, writing, and teaching in a wide range of areas, including U.S. and international macroeconomics, fiscal policy, labor markets, and competition policy. He co-teaches Ec 10, Principles of Economics, the largest course at Harvard University. Mark Wu is the Henry L. Stimson Professor at Harvard Law School, where he specializes in international trade and international economic law. His writings cover a broad range of topics, including the impact of emerging economies on global governance, digital technologies, trade remedies, environment, and foreign investment. Welcome, everyone, and take it away.
Great. Thank you all for being here. I think you're all in for a real treat because Professor Furman is truly one of the world's leading experts in terms of thinking about the complexities of the economy, but also their tie into policy. So any of you who are interested in that, I think we're going to have a great discussion. Jason, I thought I'd start off our conversation by... I don't know why. Siri, please. All right. Jason, welcome to HLS, and I thought what we would begin by doing is just sort of painting a picture of the current state of the American economy. The way I sometimes do it in very simplistic form for our law students is to say, we've got a services economy that's actually the largest employer part of the economy. It's actually still very robust when it comes to trade. We have a digital economy that's tied to the services economy, again, right, where we see very fast growth, leading edge stuff. We have a commodities-based economy, thinking about agriculture, energy, and so forth, where we still continue to export, but it's obviously less important from an employment standpoint. And then we have the industrial economy, which is what garners a lot of attention, but accounts for a smaller percentage of actual employment, and we've seen diminishing or hollowing out of that portion of it. And when we look at the state of those, we see very different pictures in terms of both our competitiveness, as well as the jobs impact, as well as the trade impact. But the focus is really on whether or not a shift in trade policy is needed given the hollowing out of the manufacturing sector and the industrial economy. So I just want to start by inviting you to sort of say a little bit more about why there is so much attention on that portion of the economy. Is this outsized attention? Is this necessary? What are some of the spillover effects socially, politically, and so on and so forth?
Great. So it's great. This is on?
Yep.
It's great to have me here, to be here. And the first economics lessons I had were an HLS student who was a section leader when I took Ec 10 as an undergraduate here. So if we have one of our section leaders here, and if anyone else wants to apply, we're always looking for more. So on this topic, the facts about manufacturing in the U.S. economy is that it's less than 10% of employment. Employment has been falling steadily as a share of overall employment since the end of World War II. That decline is globally. China is a massive manufacturing powerhouse globally, unparalleled in the history of the world, but it also has actually seen declining manufacturing employment and has big unemployment problems in China right now. Germany also declining manufacturing employment. And that's because a big part of what's going on is that technology improves in the manufacturing sector much faster than any other part of the economy. I don't have the statistics in my head, but you think 200 years ago, how much work would you need to do to buy a watch for a typical person, it could be years of work or a lifetime of work to make enough money to buy a watch. Now you can buy, a much better digital watch for, half an hour, 15 minutes of work. And that's the productivity we have in that sector, as opposed to Harvard Law School classes, which still take like one person, 1 hour to teach 120 students, just like it did 100 years ago. Not much technology improvement there, and not in my class either. So that is a big backdrop for manufacturing. A big question in the sector is economists as a whole tend to not think of manufacturing jobs as different from other jobs. One economist famously said, potato chips, microchips, what's the difference? And but a lot of non-economists tend to think there's something different about it. One possibility is that the non-economists are just confused and romanticizing the past. Both our current president and the one before were above average enthusiastic about manufacturing for American presidents, and they also are on the older end of the spectrum, both of them. And so maybe they're just remembering some fantastical version of the past. A second possibility is that manufacturing jobs are good jobs. They're a pathway into the middle class. It's something that you can do without, really high level of education, and we want them for that reason. A third, which is related, is that they're really important to communities, that communities will disproportionately depend on their local manufacturing jobs. I'm a little bit skeptical of 2 and 3. The wage premium in manufacturing used to possibly be a real thing, but seems to be gone, and if anything, seems to be paid less. Manufacturing today employs people, for people without a college degree. Manufacturing increasingly employs just a small number of people with postgraduate degrees. Microchip factories will have 2 people in them, and they won't be sort of normal middle class jobs. Then there's a last argument, which is the one that I frankly have the hardest time understanding what I think about, and that's national security. And for certain things that we should be able to make tanks in the event of war and shouldn't import all of our tanks from China, that seems like a reasonable and obvious thing, and nor should we be exporting our best tanks to China. That's pretty obvious. What about microchips, where most of what they're used for is civilian, not military? What about cars? Do you need car factories so you can convert them to tank factories in the event of a war? What about clothing? Soldiers need uniforms in a war. Does that mean you need to make clothing? What about solar panels? For all of these and on the national security ground is where I'm somewhat open, but somewhat uncertain. I've seen the argument stretched. I literally once heard a glove manufacturer talk about how important it was to make gloves in the United States, and wasn't overly persuaded by that national security case, but some of them seem quite clearly true.
Great. So I think that helps to sort of frame the conversation a little bit. Let me ask one other sort of background piece of information before we dive into the tariffs and its impact on the economy, which is, I think, the focus of our talk today. One of the questions we debate here at the law school is when you have periods of uncertainty, and there are a number of different uncertain questions, right? What's the pace of technological improvement? What's the likelihood of some form of geopolitical conflict? What's something today that might not be thought of as a dual-use technology, but tomorrow would become one? And we've seen that scope grow over the course of time. How do you think about regulating upfront with the possibility that you introduce too much friction, too much transaction costs, possibly choke the golden goose that sort of feeds the innovation, as opposed to regulating too late, as we've seen in other sorts of circumstances where, wow, if Europe had realized it perhaps shouldn't have been so dependent on Russian natural gas and had a plan B, they'd be in a better situation to begin with. How do you think about those types of trade-offs under conditions of vast and growing uncertainty?
Yeah, I mean, one place where I've spent a lot of time thinking about that, which is not the same as what you asked, but because I have a better answer to that question, I'll give it, and then I'll, in the meantime, try to think of the answer to yours, was in the context of digital competition, where I was chaired an expert review panel for the UK government to overhaul how they handle digital platforms. And reluctantly, over the course of that review process, came to the conclusion that the litigation process ex post was just too slow, that a case could take could take a decade. By the time the case was resolved, the competitors would be gone. It would be impossible to have, a level playing field for a new one, whatever it was. And so it was better to do it ex ante and to set a set of clear rules in advance for what platforms can and can't do. And the UK passed a law that did that and has a digital markets union. And then the EU did a version of it that was, I think, more interventionist and less thoughtful than the masterpiece that was the UK one, based on my recommendations. But part of the issue there was it felt like a mature enough industry that while there's still lots of innovation and change, it wasn't at the very early sort of Wild West, uncertain stage. And so the costs and benefits of could you have regulation, could you not? Another thing is when you have regulation that applies to just the big players and not to the startups and the entrants, you can still sort of have the competition, innovation, and entry while just worrying about the incumbents. My worry is that with national security type considerations, none of those apply. I mean, it's not like you can let a small business self-deal on a platform and a large business not. It's not like you can let a small business violate national security and a large business not. And so, I don't know. I'm not sure the right answer to your question, Mark. I think it would be very case by case. But in general, I think my fundamental view is that a mistake we make is thinking that the United States knows more than China about everything, which was sort of, to a first approximation, true 20 years ago. It is not remotely true in the energy sector today. It's not entirely true in the AI and digital sector today. And so some of what we're trying to choke off China from getting, we're also choking off ourselves from learning. And so when I look at Europe, I think their end game with auto tariffs is to get China to invest in Europe and Europe to basically get the same types of benefits in learning and technology transfer that China got 25 years ago from Europe. And I'd like to see more of that and more openness to that in the United States.
I'll add just in response to that. I think one of the things I'm a little bit more skeptical of on that front, right, is simply the political economy under which Western, US or European multinationals operated is very different than, say, these Chinese multinationals. So even if Europe puts forward this open posture, it'll be interesting to see whether or not the National Reform and Development Commission in China allows its multinationals to take some of the best technologies overseas or to adapt them. But we'll see. We're going to see a natural experiment play out over the next 3 to 5 years as Europe welcomes this in and the U.S. doesn't. And, we'll see what unfolds there.
Oh, yeah. And first of all, I mean, a lot of our joint ventures in China didn't put their best technology into China either. China, I think, would be even more vigilant about having Chinese workers, Chinese control of the information, all of that. So I'm not under any illusion as to how large the gains of that are, but I think they're positive and worth a shot.
So what I wanted to return to was your anecdote about the digital sphere, and I think something similar has played out here in the trade sphere, where 20 years ago, if we were sitting here, we were talking about some of these frictions, there would be a resort to law, and particularly thinking about the WTO as a place to go and adjudicate these types of disputes or to reform or update the rules. And one of the things we saw play out was those adjudications did not necessarily lead to systemic change. They might have addressed the issue in dispute in that particular sector. And I know some of our firms, say, for example, in the payments industry, would even dispute that. But the larger question has really been the failure of lawyers, to be able to reach some form of a consensus to update the rules, or when updating the rules, leaving too many loopholes open, say, for example, with the TPP, which would have allowed backdoors and so forth. So in some ways, where we are today, I want to point out to the audience, is also part of the failure of the imagination of lawyers to really sort of seize the mandate before them, which leads me to say, inevitably in that type of scenario, right, where you have uncertainty, where you've got national security issues more at the forefront, the world feeling more precarious than ever, whether we're talking politically or socially or whatever the case might be, for the turn to some other instrument. And I guess I want to start by just asking, is tariffs part of that playbook, but necessary but not sufficient, right? When we were looking at effective tariff rates of, say, under 3% in this country, did that feel too low? If tariffs is just part of that playbook, what else needs to be part of that playbook for tariffs to work and so forth, before we go into sort of what the ripple effects are to the economy?
Yeah, so I mean, I should just disclose that I come at all of this from a perspective of like a severe case of TDS, which is tariff derangement syndrome. But why don't I try to be a little bit charitable first, and then I'll give you all the things that we teach in my class, correctly so, about tariffs. But, you know, there's been historically a little bit of a division that it's like okay to use sanctions as an instrument to accomplish your goals in foreign policy, but somehow you're not really supposed to touch tariffs. And so the idea that you have multiple tools for accomplishing your foreign policy goals, and this should be one of them, in some ways makes a certain amount of sense. And it was almost this sort of purist, like, don't use my thing for this other purpose. Now, part of that does involve a different mindset than we hear about tariffs right now. When sanctions were done against Russia, first by the Obama administration, then by the Biden administration, no one ever got up and said these sanctions will help strengthen the American middle class, will create good, high-paying jobs, will increase American economic growth. In fact, it was understood that by putting sanctions on Russia, we were actually going to hurt ourselves. I think like a little bit. The magnitude I think is quite small, but like hurt growth, make things more expensive, reduce the value of some of our companies in the stock market, et cetera. But that it was worth paying that cost because we had a goal we wanted to accomplish. And do you want to pay $10 to, have, Ukraine be safe? Like, yes, I want to do that. Obviously, it was more than $10 and wasn't fully buying safety for Ukraine. So the idea that you would extend this to tariffs, I think is okay, but then you want people not making an argument that, hey, this is great for America and American workers. You want them at least privately, if not in public, saying this is a cost. What is the cost of the tariffs? What is the national security benefit? How do we weigh those against each other? The second thing that I've updated my own views on in the last 6 months is there has been much, much less retaliation than I expected to US tariffs. Europe, Japan, the United Kingdom, basically all sort of rolled over, made concessions to the United States, accepted a pretty high baseline level of tariffs. Canada has done some response. China has done some response and is probably dialing up more in all sorts of ways that we can and can't see, like not buying US soybeans. But it turns out maybe the United States has somewhat more leverage than I would have thought. And I think part of what's going on there is if you have a sort of madman negotiating theory, and by the way, a madman negotiating theory could be an actual madman or could be somebody pretending to be a madman. I'm not taking a stance on that question. And we go to Europe and we say, here's our plan, our negotiation. Whatever you do on tariffs, we're going to do that plus 15. And if Europe believes that, the right thing for Europe isn't to do like 30% punishment against the United States because we'll do 45, isn't to do 45 because we'll do 60. It's to do 0, and then we'll do 15. And I think that's how the Europeans read it, and that's roughly where we ended up. Now, just to be clear, I think the main victims of the 15% tariff on Europe is the United States, not Europe. I don't think there's some foreign policy objective we have in Europe on par with what we had with Russia related to Ukraine or what we have with China, but just as sort of a proof case that maybe the United States does have more leverage, and if there is something where it's worth the cost of using that leverage to get, having that be in the toolkit may not be the very worst thing.
So I want to turn then a little bit more deeply to this question of what is the cost, right? One of the things that has been interesting is to watch the state of the U.S. economy. And I started by describing to say it's really multiple economies, right? If you look at it. But two things that you've highlighted that I just want to draw into the conversation. One is, right, the U.S. economy is growing, at least the second quarter statistics suggest, quite robustly, albeit the first quarter we saw a downturn. So, we can question what's going on here, but I'd posit, there was a bit of a shock in the first term, followed by a number of different things in terms of wanting to front load in case and stockpiling. Also, the expiration of the electric vehicle subsidies and so forth drove auto sales in the second quarter and so forth. But we're seeing sort of still a relatively healthy economy, albeit slowing job growth and so forth. But one of the things that you highlighted is that almost seems to be driven by the AI, and particularly an AI infrastructure type of boom. And absent that, we really are looking at a flat economy right now. So just want to sort of draw that into the conversation. How much do you think we actually have a good sense of what's going on? And then the other part is, right, the tariff impact. When President Trump first announced these, everyone was going to say, we're going to be in a recession, and it's going to be one that's going to be long-lasting for some time, and we're going to see inflation go up. Now, certainly the falling inflation has stopped. It's sort of just inflation figures are no longer declining as they did, but they also haven't done a big U-turn yet. But again, I want to just ask that question on the yet part of it. So give us your take on, all of these mixed signals. What do you think is actually going on right now in terms of tariffs in the American economy?
Yeah, so it's a great question. If you try to predict what would happen from the level of tariffs that we have, the macro and trade models tended to predict things like reduce GDP growth by 0.5%, maybe 1%, reduce the level of GDP in the long run by 0.25% to 0.5%. In April, I was sort of puzzled because the markets were tanking, the tariffs were enormous, and in some ways the panic was larger than what these models said. And just to understand what these models are, and one of the good ones is run by a HLS graduate, Natasha Sarin, who's now a professor at another law school south of here. And it's, what they do is they're pretty basic in some ways. They take lots of different sectors, lots of different countries, and they say, you put the tariffs into the model, and it says, oh, blank goes up by 15% in cost. The typical elasticity is 2/3, so people buy 10% less of it. That's an input to this other thing they make, so they make 5% less of that, and they just trace through all of it. The answers these models spit out isn't like the truth, but at least it's sort of consistent and adds up and takes into account all the different sectors and all the different countries. So anyway, they were giving numbers like this. At the time, I thought one possibility is that the models were wrong and that the people in their panic were right, and that what the models don't have is psychology, uncertainty, the way in which businesses said we're not going to invest at all until we figure out what's going on, and that type of pullback. On the other hand, at this moment, it looks to me a little bit like the models either were right or at least can't prove them wrong based on the data we see, haven't been falsified based on the data we've seen. So all the sort of extra uncertainty stuff like that, for whatever set of reason, doesn't seem to have been important. If you think it's 0.5 point off economic growth, and last year we grew at 2.5%, and this year we might grow at 2%, we'll see, maybe a little bit less than 2%. And by the way, we've had a big positive shock in terms of data centers, which is the majority of economic growth this year. It's totally plausible that our growth rate this year would have been 0.5 point higher absent the tariffs. On inflation, I've revised down a little bit. In some ways, maybe should have known. I mean, I was talking to people at the IMF, and they were talking to me about their models, 6 months ago, and saying that, for a variety of reasons, that they weren't expecting a big effect on U.S. inflation from the tariffs. And I think I embraced a little bit too much of a naive pass-through. Most of what's happened on inflation, though, has been that the tariffs have been paid in the United States, but they've been paid by American companies, not by American consumers. Now, on both growth and inflation, the tariffs increased again in August, so we don't have any data yet for September, and we won't get any data for September until the government reopens. Even September is too soon to see some of the effects of these policies. On the corporate pass-through on prices, if you're an auto company and the president is saying, if you raise prices, I'm going to punish you, you don't raise prices for a couple months in a row. But GM and Ford are both making big quarterly losses. They are not going to sell cars at a loss for the rest of time. They are going to raise prices. So I think some of the pass-through to consumers will grow over time. So the sort of bottom line of this, Mark, is that I think there probably has been a macro impact already. There'll probably be somewhat more, but it's not as dramatic as people thought. And in some ways, it's actually a vindication of economics, and we should have believed our models rather than letting ourselves, and I did to some degree, I'll think less than many of my peers, get caught up in a sort of broader hysteria. Because ultimately trade, as you said in the beginning, or directionally said, it's 10% of the US economy. Most of what we do is not trade, and most of the economy is going on, and some parts of it, like data centers, are going on like crazy.
So I'll ask one last question and open up to the audience. Do you think our students here should think of this as we've basically reached a type of new normal? I mean, on the one hand, if I told you a year ago, right, our effective tariff rates are going to be back to where they were in the 1930s, right? You would have said, really? And then I said, but the American economy is going to be, humming along, and job growth will be flat, but we're not going to be in a state of a recession. Or do you think we're still in the very early stages of a very unstable period? And we're going to see a number of these different ripple effects play itself out. Or is really the bigger uncertainty question here is really what's the productivity gains coming about from AI and some of these other emergent technologies? And as long as we have that going on, this is about as good a time as any to be putting in place a national security strategy where there's some costs because we've got other parts to sort of offset that. I mean, how should our students here, especially the ones who are going to be headed out to the workforce next year, really be thinking about this issue of tariffs and its interplay with the economy?
Yeah, so first of all, by the way, I should have given you context at the beginning. The US average tariff rate last year was 3%. In President Trump's first term, there was lots and lots of attention to his protectionism. He raised it by less than a percentage point over the whole 4 years. This time, he's raised it from 3 to 18. And that is a rate that, as Mark said, we haven't seen since the 1930s. And we've actually never seen an increase in a single year as large as the one we've had this year, at least not for at least 125 years that I've looked at the data. So it's really, really quite extraordinary, the sea change we've seen.
And let me interrupt you for 1 minute here, right? And historically, in the early years of the Republic, it was always, right, at this 30% or above rate. Sometimes much higher, but then it really sunk, especially for the post-war era.
Yeah, so it is, in one way, I've been more positive about tariffs because I'm trying to give all sides here. In one way, it's sort of extraordinary that a problem we've had from my perspective in the US economy is we have a large budget deficit. And part of why we have a large budget deficit is just a complete allergic negativity about any form of tax increase on anyone, except one party likes to raise taxes on 1% of people, and the other party doesn't like to raise taxes on anyone. And here we've done a $3 trillion tax increase on basically everyone in the country, and it's not super popular, but it's not like totally toxic yet either. And that's sort of amazing to me that we've done that. The problem is it's a particularly terrible form of tax for a variety of reasons. First is you might think, oh, it's just like a consumption tax. And for some people, consumption taxes are the ideal form of taxation. Well, it's a weird type of consumption tax because it's on 10% of what you buy. And in economics, you would much rather have a 1% tax rate on everything rather than a 10% tax rate on some things. So broad-based lower rate. So it's the opposite of that. Second of all, it's not just on a subset of consumption. It also applies to intermediate inputs like steel, which actually have their own special tariffs, and to capital equipment. And so in that sense, it's almost like a capital tax more than it's like a consumption tax, which has the virtue of not taxing capital. And it's a capital tax that is particularly targeted and harmful for industry that if you're an auto company using steel, well, it's more expensive to make a car. If you're using a machine that's made abroad, it's more expensive for you to get that and locate here. So it's a pretty poorly designed tax. The basic way I think about it is the US economy 5 years from now is going to have an unemployment rate of 4%. I know that because the Fed will make sure that that's true, or they'll try their hardest. And if it's not 4 years from now, then 6 years from now or 7 years from now. And the question is, what jobs are people doing? And when you have tariffs, we're making more stuff for ourselves and importing less of that stuff. And so we're not increasing the number of jobs, we're changing the types of jobs. And to a first approximation, I think the market picks the better types of jobs. If we're more productive at something and have higher wages, we have more of that. And that's the tech industries and all the others we talked about. And if it's making shoes or clothing or gloves, we're not very productive at it. The wages aren't very high. We don't do that. Instead, we buy that stuff from abroad, and we have the classic gains from trade. So as an economic strategy, I think it's quite poor. But then I'll sort of end this with what was part of your question, Mark, and linking to what I said before, which is I think it is valid for national security. So for example, I'm worried about how dependent the United States is on drones from China. Those are dual-use technology, but they're really important in the event of war, and we're seeing that in Ukraine right now. So I wouldn't mind if 5 years from now, when 96% of Americans have jobs, if more of them are making drones than the market would have make drones. And to be clear, I don't think that because those wages are high. I don't think that because we're very productive at drones. I think actually, economically, we'd be better off not making the drones and importing all of them. But I'd like to have that resilience for the case of national security. And that, in some sense, is what upsets me most about the tariffs, is they're just really, really poorly designed in that respect. They don't distinguish in many cases between friend and foe. If you look at what the tariff rates were, and handed somebody a list of the countries, those across the board tariff rates were high on some of our closest allies, were low on some countries we didn't like, exempted Russia. They don't distinguish between sectors that are important for national security in a way that I think is meaningful and real versus not. They don't take into account friendshoring. They don't help you build a coalition to deal with some of the issues in the global economy, many of which I think are related to China. So I think in some ways it's sort of a tragic lost opportunity to do the one thing that tariffs really can play a role in, which is targeted and specific. So I think we don't want a larger manufacturing sector as a whole. I don't know that the tariffs will even do that because of what they're due to intermediate imports and the like. But there are certain pockets of manufacturing we do want to be larger, and we need to have a thoughtful conversation at what they are, how to do it, and this is not that. This is that conversation, but the one in Washington is not that conversation.
And I'll add a few more, right? Part of that, I think, in terms of making the investments in education, particularly in upskilling for our workforce, mobility in terms of our workforce, also creating the right set of incentives for our firms to produce here, procurement contract redesign, right? So there's a lot here that I think for you all here as lawyers who are going to be involved in shaping the policies, you can definitely help create. And I think it's a world that you're going to be stepping into where these questions aren't going to be going away. So with that note, let me open up the floor for questions. May I ask if you could please wait until, Emily, will you bring over a microphone? If you could please identify yourself and please keep it to one question.
And as lawyers, you should try to figure out an argument why, for example, universal preschool is a response to an international emergency that the United States faces with imminent invasion if we don't have more skilled and talented people. So you don't need Congress for it. You can just do it on your own.
Professor Furman, thank you for your time on the legal style at the law school.
It's actually not great.
No, it's not. I'm curious because I appreciate the discussion of the economic and the legal dimensions of trade, but it's hard to overlook the political backdrop of tariffs. And even under a more trade-friendly administration, such as the administration you were part of, Professor Furman, under President Obama, even economists like Milton Friedman would say that wasn't enough. We could have always gone further on the free trade route. We subsidize certain sectors of the economy like sugar, ethanol, and to appeal to constituencies that are politically necessary to win a governing coalition. And so I'm curious, what economists, how you would navigate those conversations, and what economists would say is like the trade-off between, policies that are economically no-brainers, like on trade, versus constituents who are willing to accept, a reduction, in certain purchasing power or material well-being for other non-pecuniary, non-quantifiable, preferences that they see being furthered. And in this case, I would say it could be whether it's like reduction in immigration, or whether it's like putting their values or the boosting America's morale, these psychological factors that seem to have clouded or have always been there, but in this case, it seems more pronounced. Was that a part of the conversations you had under the Obama administration? And do you see some of that fueling and motivating the policies we see today?
Yeah, so first of all, my view is the role of an economist in government is to be an economist in government, which is to say, here are the consequences of different courses of policy. This one will help growth this much, that one will hurt growth that much. And that's one input into a decision. If President Obama had listened to my advice on every single topic, he wouldn't have had a second term, and he would have had a disastrous presidency because all sorts of things wouldn't have passed Congress, would have blown up with interest groups, et cetera. I see people make the mistake sometimes in government of figuring out what the decision maker wants to hear and telling them that, or trying to do too much politics. And there was no room I was in that didn't have a lot of incredibly politically skilled people. It wasn't like there was any danger that it would just be me alone in the room with the president. I'd persuade him of some economic thing. I'd be naive politically, and we'd die as a result. There were 8 other people to catch those sorts of things for every economist. That's what I viewed as my job. On TPP, I wasn't part of the discussions when we launched it, because the first 4 years of the administration, I was on the domestic side. I then had domestic and international in my portfolio for the second term, and worked on it. But there were some economists that were 100% for free trade, basically told the president, this is going to add a few basis points to economic growth over the next decade. It's just not that important. And by the way, if you thought politically it was a bad thing to do, don't do it for me, an economist, because it's just, I have 8 other things that are more important and more exciting than this. And he ultimately chose to do it, I think, frankly, more for national security reasons, some of it related to sort of building an American-like order that extended to both sides of the Pacific, that either could include China if China changed to some degree, or could exclude China if it didn't. So I don't know. And then politically, trade is just the classic, small, diffuse benefits and concentrated, up against concentrated interests who are on the other side of it. So the number of times you end up doing something where you spend $1 million per job saved because the people that paid the million, their share of the million have no idea. The people whose jobs saved do. And so I worry that the whole thing gets more special interest. But, political system is imperfect in lots of ways.
And I'll use that anecdote, right, just to point out to the lawyers in the room. You do have a skill, right, that it can be very useful in these types of conversations. So on the TPP debate, right, there were a lot of economists presenting dueling models about what the impact is. But actually, the key part of that, at least for certain key advanced manufacturing sectors, are the rules of origin. And there's no way yet today that we have an effective way of modeling that in the general equilibrium models on trade. I mean, we have professors and students here who are working on thinking about how to update that. And so your knowledge of that, right, drives a different input into the decision-making process. And, we can speculate as to what may or may not have happened if Secretary Clinton had won there. But the fact of the matter is there's also political constraints on other parts when you talk to the other TPP 11, right, that they're just not willing to sort of update and accept a certain set of rules of origin. And I think that will be a matter that still continues to play out as we see these new transshipment rules and so forth come about under the Trump administration as well. So, I just want to point out to the lawyers, right, there's a set of skill set that you have, a set of skill sets that the economists have, and you need to sort of pair those together in order to shape effective policy here.
And usually the lawyers get the final say in that policy, so.
Professor, thank you for coming here. My question is around the models we keep talking about and whether economists need a different set of data to look at when making decisions or evaluating the state of the economy. We talk a lot about GDP, but GDP is not the be-all end-all for how healthy an economy is. The stock market is roaring, but the stock market is not, a thermometer on how good the economy is. The jobs figures are revised down. We're gonna have to wait to see what September looks like. Is the economic data sets that policymakers and economists have been using for the past 2, 3, 4 decades still fit for purpose for the next decade or two? Are there different sources of data you think we should be looking at to get more up-to-date a feeling on how the economy is doing, or how do you refine your models looking forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. Anyone who's making a judgment about things should hopefully be looking at a wide range of things. You might look at the impact on GDP. We talked about national security. That's a hard one to measure. In another domain, you might look at how much carbon emissions you have, or how many people get health insurance, or what it does to the poverty rate. So when you're thinking about public policy, usually you're thinking of a few different outcomes and measuring their success using a few different metrics. There's been this long-standing desire to try to create a single thing that brings all of those in, like a version of GDP that takes into account inequality and destruction of the climate and things like that. And there have been proposals over the years. I think most of those have been unsuccessful. They're really complicated, they're really arbitrary, and moreover, the Human Development Index is the biggest, most successful of them that the UN produces. You look at it, and it's almost perfectly correlated with per capita GDP. So yeah, you put all this other stuff in, but it turns out if your country is 3 times richer per person, on average, not even distribution, than another one, you're like better at this broader set of measures. So I wouldn't try to find a new number that is the one number. I would just make sure you're bringing in different numbers and bring in the right ones where appropriate. Income distribution, another one that matters too, by the way, I should add. And there's a lot of data on that. People don't look at it as much as they look at the stock market, because you get the stock market every second. You get the income inequality numbers once a year, and that sort of saddens me, but I don't know how to fix it.
What is your perspective on the Republican reconciliation bill? Do you think that had any impact on blunting the effects of tariffs on companies, on businesses?
You mean the One Big Beautiful Bill Act?
I do.
I largely didn't like it. I mean, in sort of order one, I didn't like the Medicaid cuts, which I think will mean 10 million people or so or more will lose health insurance. I think some of what was done on the tax side, all of it was more expensive than we can afford as a country, and some of it was complicating the tax code. I think there was, on the demand side, it will have some upfront demand. So of the different countervailing forces, we talked about the data centers. The other one is there is about 1% of GDP of fiscal stimulus from that bill, which is to say 1% of GDP more deficit next year than we had this past year. So that'll help in the short run, but that just also means the Fed will keep interest rates higher than they otherwise would have kept them. So, I think that's more neutralized than not, but maybe some of it creeps through. There were a few things like making expensing for business investment permanent that I think were a good thing to do in the tax code, and I like, but doesn't outweigh the rest of it for me. But even under the most optimistic, excited people about OBBA, the macro impacts are really quite small compared to the tariffs, because the big things were in the first legislation. We cut the corporate rate from 35 to 21. This one was much more on the individual side, and my Republican friends who are more excited about it than me didn't think that was the important side.
I have 2 questions. The first one is it possible that the administration was using this sort of overarching tariff policies motivated by the failure of the US-China phase 1 deal, because that was a more targeted strategic initiative towards a trading partner that we saw with the sort of global economic position? And my second question is, what is the likely impact of the tariffs now that the US is imposing to the position of the US in the global supply chain? Because the way I see it is that more than it causing inflation and sort of a reduction in the size of GDP, the US is now an unreliable trading partner. The tariffs are unpredictable. It's hard to really rely on them for essential raw material or critical raw material or even responsive for essential supplies.
Yeah. So on your first question, I didn't, in the first Trump administration, as you know from asking the question, our main objective was for China to buy more stuff from the United States in an effort to reduce our trade deficit. I never thought that objective made any sense because some things they'd buy from us meant somebody else wouldn't buy that same thing, so it wouldn't necessarily change our overall trade balance. Moreover, I thought you could only do it unilaterally. You couldn't form a coalition with Japan and Europe to get China to buy American soybeans and airplanes. And I thought most of the issues that we needed to deal with required building a coalition to address. So, and then China, of course, didn't live up to it. I worry now that I'm not sure what our objective is with China. I think, worrying about resilience in the U.S. economy and not being overly dependent on certain key things and national security, those are all really, really important. But getting China to buy more of random stuff of ours, I think, is actually not that important. And I worry that we're more excited about the second than the first, but I'm not sure. Remind me on your second question. Oh, right. I mean, this is another place where it's just so, this is where, again, we talked about the models before and their limitations. It's so incredibly hard. I mean, I talked to a medium-sized head of a manufacturing business, and, for him, it's changed nothing because they used to get some raw material in, now they add a screw to it, and they spend 2 hours doing it in Canada before it comes here, and then it comes in under, NAFTA or whatever. I mean, they've done things like that to keep going like normal. I've heard stories of, the auto companies are moving certain things back here to the United States because they just don't want to pay the tariffs to go over the border. But then there's other people who are moving things overseas because of it. So things are moving every which direction, depending on what market you're serving, what your supply chain is like. Broadly, I would think in the long run, yes, that this makes us less a reliable part of the supply chain, that the American auto industry exists because we're integrated with Canada and Mexico, just like Asia has integrated ones, just like the European Union, of course, is a single market. So integrated, and if we get rid of that, mostly we haven't, fortunately, but if we fully get rid of that, we'd have a hard time competing with supply chains. But I do think it's complicated and lots of things go lots of directions.
I'll add two thoughts, right? So just building on your second question, in business you have this phrase, you have China for China, and then you have China for the world, right? And so different people invest in China either just for the Chinese market or because they believe, right, that the supply chain in East Asia is the world's most globally competitive and they're building that out for the world. I think supply chain wise, right, you may eventually start to see more of North America for North America, right? That type of concept, we may see some shifts there. It's a little too early for that, but it really is very sector specific, and then depends on, right, what's the fixed investment, what are the alternatives, what's the pace of technological change, a whole variety of various different factors. But I do think, right, this concept of, right, U.S. for U.S. or North America for North America is one that, will probably add to our vernacular a little bit, just like we have China for China, right? On the first question, this is an area that I think will be interesting to watch, right? Because one thing we know that's been important for President Trump is this issue of respect. And this was an agreement that his negotiators negotiated. The Chinese side obviously hated it. The main negotiator on the Chinese side is no longer in a position of power in government, right? His successor has not embraced this. And so it'll be interesting to see how much this comes up if there's a possible deal with China about this being an enduring sign of disrespect, right? It was easy for President Trump to say, oh, they didn't do that with the Biden administration because the Biden administration folks were weak and they didn't respect it and so forth. But they haven't done it with the Trump administration either. And it'll be interesting to see what psychologically that impact has on the political discourse as we see whether or not there's something that happens with China. What I've seen with China is, right, sort of the escalatory point. Both sides escalated and got to a pain point where they couldn't tolerate it. We have a bit of a ceasefire, but effective tariff rates are way higher on both sides of that, even with the exceptions. And so, we'll see whether they can live with that supply chain-wise.
I'm interested in what you think of the argument that manufacturing expertise is a precondition to innovation and capturing the gains from innovation. Like in the sort of watch education example, I'd rather run a company or invest in a company that's going to make a new watch than a company that's doing education because there aren't a lot of gains.
I guess I'm reasonably skeptical of that. That you look at the value that Apple and NVIDIA have compared to the value that TSMC and Foxconn have, and it's just sort of, literally an order of magnitude, 10x or more. And some of these things, like the memory chips, are basically commodities, and you can't, if you just have two companies making a commodity, that's enough to price it at marginal cost. To lead you to price it at marginal cost and to not get anything out of it. There's just, and most of the innovation we need in our economy is actually innovation in the service sector and how we're going to apply things like AI to the service sector. Hopefully not to replace all the legal jobs for another 30 years. But I don't know, so I'm somewhat skeptical. Again, if what you want is to know how to make stuff because it's important to make that stuff because you want to make the drones here in the United States for our safety, absolutely, I think you need sort of communities and networks of people figuring out how to tinker and get the new screw that you need and the things that Shenzhen does incredibly well. But if you want actual good jobs and economic growth, living 6 people in a dormitory, in a compound to make the iPhones, we can do much better things in the United States than that.
Hi, professors. So earlier you mentioned that it's actually better for the US economy if we were to import rather than to produce domestically. Can you just walk through the logic behind that in terms of the trade deficit problem and unemployment and why it's still better, say, without national security concerns?
Yeah. So the amount you import and export, the amount you import doesn't necessarily affect your trade deficit. You could be a country that imports 10% of GDP and exports 10% of GDP, and another country imports 30% of GDP and exports 30% of GDP. My mental model in economics is largely that imports and exports sort of move up and down together. And this isn't exactly true, but I think it's close enough to true that we can go with it. So if we do things to reduce the amount we import, we're going to take resources that would have gone to exporting stuff and instead put those resources into making stuff for Americans. And so we'll end up exporting less too. And so I don't see any of these tariffs as having a meaningful impact on our trade deficit. And there's a lot of research on this, a lot of historical experience. So basically what you want to choose is, do we want to be a country that imports and exports 12% or imports and exports 9%? Now, if you're worried about our trade deficit, and I think it's on the edge of where we should be worried about it, it might be okay for a country like the United States to run a trade deficit of this size. A little bit more would definitely be a problem. What you want to do is, as a country, save more, so that we're in economics, you sort of learn one of the things that we are 100% sure is true, is that the difference between how much you save and how much you invest is equal to your trade balance. And so largely our problem is that we're over-consuming, and a lot of that consumption is funded from abroad. I'm not positive how big a problem that is, but I am positive that the way to solve it would be to, for example, cut our budget deficit, not have higher tariffs.
Wow.
Well, one last question. While we're waiting for the question, I'll just add, right, I think on this question of savings rates and deficits and so forth, there are enduring distortionary policies on the monetary side, right? That various different actors have taken, also on the fiscal side, but it's easier to do this on the monetary side. And so I think there's also a global coordination issue that needs to be addressed there as well.
Thank you so much, Professor Furman. As we see that economic security discussions and geoeconomic competition discussions are very intertwined in the current debate. And as you said, that innovation in the service sectors are the central part in the US economy. I just wonder whether this geoeconomic competition discourses was much more focused on AI, semiconductor, drones, but rather we're not thinking in the wider picture about climate change in the green sector and green industry. Do you think that the current, the reason behind this is more the attitude towards climate change of this current administration, or there are other industrial economic considerations of the United States economic structure? Thank you.
I mean, the global conversation on climate change has just shrunk so rapidly. I mean, in the United States, it's basically non-existent because this administration is not interested in it. Democrats, I think, truly in their heart of hearts care about it, but don't think it's a politically winning issue, so they're largely not talking about it either. You know, there's a global conference I go to, and most every year in the past, there would be like a macro panel, and then there'd be one on climate change, and this year is macro, and AI. And so some of the global conversation is diminished, and yeah, I think it's a shame because I think climate change remains a problem. It's also a problem that we actually know how to solve. A carbon tax would get us 85% of the way to the solution. There's other stuff that we could do in addition to that, but that to me is the most important part of it. So I view it as sort of a solved problem in the laboratory, but there hasn't been a lot of take up of the things developed in that lab. I mean, there's a whole set of interesting trade issues and CBAM and how you do border adjustment and stuff like that related to climate change. And I'm not totally steeped in them, but I'm largely sympathetic to once you do have something like a carbon price, that you do get to do some form of adjustment on your border and stop things from coming in. And there's some economic reason for that, and there's probably even more political reason to build a coalition.
Anyone else? Well, please join me in thanking Mark and Jason for coming today.